I want you to define a term that you see when you go to the Legacy Museum, when you go to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, and that is racial terror lynchings. Do I have that right?
Yes, that's right. So what we're talking about are lynchings that were designed to terrorize people based on their race. In, I think, popular culture, we have a notion that lynchings were what happened when someone was hanged. And of course, lots of lynching victims weren't actually hanged. They were drowned, they were beaten to death, they were shot, they were burned alive. And so when we talk about lynchings, we're talking about a category of crime committed by groups of people. And racial terror lynchings are murders, crimes committed by groups of people of African Americans to terrorize the African American community. There was mob violence, there was frontier justice in many parts of this country where there was no functioning criminal justice system. If someone did something violent or broke the law, a group might come together to exercise punishment against that person. And in that respect, you would see white people hanged, you'd see other kinds of people hanged, but they weren't trying to terrorize the community. It was typically for a well-known violent crime around which there was some group consciousness that someone had to be punished. Black people were typically lynched in communities where there was a functioning criminal justice system. There was no need for frontier justice. And in fact, hundreds were pulled out of jails and courthouses to be lynched. And these lynchings were violence directed not just at that individual, but at the entire African American community. Black people were lynched for things like walking too close to a white woman, for asking for better wages, for preaching equality. And these violations, these social transgressions, would be something that could get African Americans lynched, and that wasn't true for anyone else. So when we talk about racial terror lynchings, we're talking about the racialized violence that was directed at African Americans following emancipation to reinforce racial hierarchy, to reinforce white supremacy. They were designed to terrorize. These bodies would sometimes, the battered bodies would be dragged through Black communities.
And I was gonna ask you about that, because it wasn't hanging the person wasn't enough.
That's right.
They were after hanged, shot, some burned, and as you were about to say, dragged through the streets, and particularly through Black communities.
Yes, it was really quite graphic. It was quite torturous, and sometimes people would be castrated or their fingers would be cut off, and this violent, torturous mutilation of the body, shooting the corpse 1,000 times, cutting off parts of the body, selling these parts as souvenirs, posing with the body as if there was something to celebrate in this barbarity. Sometimes someone would be positioned near the hanging body and would not allow the Black family or Black church or Black community to come and claim their loved one. They would insist that it hang there for 3 or 4 days to terrorize more people. There are accounts of lynchers tying the body to a vehicle and driving through the Black part of town, and if Black people went inside and closed their doors, they'd actually force people out of their homes to see these corpses dragged through the streets. And in that sense, it was terrorism. I think when people characterize the violence that we're talking about as a murder or even as a hate crime, they're not adequately appreciating the scale of it.
In talking about terror and terrorism, and the fact that you had people watching these lynchings, in some cases up to or more than 10,000 people. We've seen pictures of people posing, smiling underneath a lynched person. Where's the accountability for those people who were in those photos, who watched what happened? Is there any way to hold them accountable, even in some moral sense?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a really important question. I mean, I think, Jonathan, you've gotten to the heart of why we're trying to do what we do. You cannot engage, participate, look the other way in the face of this kind of spectacle violence and go unharmed, go unchanged. White families would bring their small children and they would lift them up so they could get a better view of this human being being burned to death, this human being being tortured, this human being being mutilated. And the psychic trauma, the scarring, the injury that does to a normal, healthy human being can't really be measured. And when we don't express that this is wrong, and when we don't hold people accountable, what we do is we create a relationship to these Black people that suggests that their victimization is not the same as the victimization of other people. When you hurt Black people, when you batter Black people, when you beat Black people, it's not a crime, it's not bad, it's not even immoral. And that consciousness is, I think, at the heart of what is so troubling about our silence about this history. I make the point often that the people who perpetrated these racial terror lynchings weren't the Ku Klux Klan. They didn't cover their faces. This wasn't done in the middle of the night. They could have buried the bodies underground to mask this violence. But instead, they did the opposite. They lifted these bodies up. They invited the whole community to come and participate. They sometimes served lemonade and deviled eggs as refreshments while this torture was taking place. And they acculturated communities into accepting this kind of brutality against Black people. And the legacy of that, I think, is quite tragic. So accountability for me is at the heart of what we're trying to do. We can't go on. We cannot pretend that something really destructive, something really corruptive happened when communities came to celebrate this kind of violence. So we have to talk about it. We have to acknowledge the wrongfulness of it. I think we would benefit as a society if we expressed our shame about it, and everybody was complicit. Not just the people who literally showed up and hanged the person or shot the person or drowned the person. It was all the elected officials who stood out of the way. It was the federal government who did not intervene despite hundreds and hundreds of requests that there be some kind of intervention. It was law enforcement. And the tragedy of that terror, which is still felt in communities today. Older people of color come up to me sometimes and they say, Mr. Stevenson, I get angry when I hear somebody on TV talking about how we're dealing with domestic terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They said, we grew up with terror. We had to worry about being bombed and lynched and menaced every day of our lives. And it actually provokes them that our nation is capable of fighting a war on terror, sending troops and spending billions to confront the threat posed by terror when our nation did nothing, while millions of people, African-American people, were being terrorized and traumatized by this violence, where they were sending away their loved ones because they couldn't feel safe and secure. And so accountability is at the heart of this. How do we recover from something so brutal, so tragic, so devastating as the legacy, as the evidence of brutal violence that is presented by these lynchings?